Welcome, everybody. Good evening here from Berlin. My name is Stefan Balzer, and I want to welcome you to another issue of our Boma studio tonight. It's an important day. I know probably many of you are still stuck on the TV screen regarding the results, but I hope that we can give you a little break, taking you on a different route for some of the thoughts. And we're looking into a topic that is probably a topic that is a global phenomenon right now. We want to dig deeper today why a lot of companies fail when it comes to innovation. Context here is pretty interesting. There's a recent study by McKinsey that says that 94% of CEOs and companies are actually not happy with the performance of innovation within their companies. And it goes into detail, why all these things fail. So we thought, let's take that topic and ask some expert. And we, there's of course many experts in the world, but we found someone based in Los Angeles, after probably he voted yesterday. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, which is Gabe Zichermann. Gabe, hello and welcome from Berlin to Los Angeles.
Hello, everybody. And I did vote well in advance, Stefan.
You did? So you're one of the reasons why there's all this counting going on, right?
Blame me for everything. I'm Canadian, so you can just blame me for everything.
Fantastic. So Gabe, and maybe I give a little insight to your background. It's better if I do that. You're an entrepreneur. You founded more than 6 companies yourself. You worked with large companies, small companies. You were, and I remember that because I had you on my stage probably 10 years ago, the first actually to come up with the word of gamification in defining and describing what gamification can mean and where it can be applied. That's about a decade ago. You've published several books, and the latest projects that you've been working on is called Failosophy. So the philosophy of failing, where you were looking into companies and actually culture in companies that have issues with failure and trying to understand why that is and why they can't embrace failure to actually then learn more from these things. So I think you're the perfect person for us today to discuss the topic. And I want to start my first question to you. If you hear that number from McKinsey, the results that 94% of CEOs are very unhappy, is that a surprise for you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, to amplify sort of my background, so people have a composite sense of this. I've always been a very entrepreneurial person. I've got a business degree, but video games were really my passion. And so, I started a bunch of companies and built and then sold the first successful digital video games platform, a company called Trimedia. So when we sold that company, we were powering about 80% of the video game industry with our technology. And one of the things that I learned in this time in the video game business in general is that the games industry is really, really different from other businesses. And oftentimes we lump all technology companies together. We say, okay, tech, we want the juice of Silicon Valley. We want the juice of tech. But I'll tell you something funny. I have been consistently hired, continue to be hired by tech companies to teach them the ways of the video game business, because the video game business is the root of the innovation that I'm really interested in. And there are so many aspects of how the games industry does things differently that are really fascinating. And so whether that's bringing game design principles forward in gamification or now through philosophy, the goal is to actually look at the deep structural issues and the kind of behavioral science, because I'm very interested in the behavioral science of why it is that innovation doesn't really gel inside of most companies. And I think there's a few key reasons.
Yeah, maybe we can dig deeper here. I think it's interesting. And probably perception from Germany, and if I look back in the last 5-10 years, it was a very common thing that large companies would send executives on a trip to learn about the innovation culture in tech companies, on the West Coast, Silicon Valley. I think there's one publishing company here, Axel Springer. They even rented a house, and they sent teams to permanently live there to actually breathe and be part of the ecosystem and to understand the thinking much better, to then bring them back and actually have them help transform the companies. What you say is that even the tech companies needed, let's say, support or some injection that actually came from gaming. Can you explain why gaming is different and what made these game companies so special?
Sure. I do want to just jump to this issue of like sending people on a tour of Silicon Valley. So the analogy that I use, which I apologize is kind of a gross analogy, but just bear with me. The idea that your teams can absorb what makes innovation culture in that way by observation or by just learning at a sort of high level, it's like the difference between gonorrhea and herpes. Okay, you want the transformation, you want the actual innovation learning to enter the cells of your business and reprogram its DNA and replicate itself over and over and over again. You don't want it to be a simple bacterial infection that just like runs through the person and they die, right? Or runs through the person and is eliminated, because that's what companies keep doing. They don't think about the like, that sort of viral replication. Anyway, I know it's coronavirus time, so viral replication is on everyone's mind. Okay, so what are some of the big things? Okay, so and for context, I feel like it's important for everybody to really be aware that when I started in the video game business, which was about 24 years ago or so, everything was sold at retail, everything was sold on CDs and DVDs.
That's right.
And there was almost no online traffic. Their independent game stores had gone out of business. There was very little happening other than this battle with Walmart. Since then, the video game business has literally transformed itself 3 times. There have been 3 giant business model shifts for video games between the year 2000 and now. Any one of those shifts killed the publishing business, killed the music business, killed the video business. Huge disruption upending that they still haven't fully solved. And yet somehow the games industry went from selling everything at Walmart to selling everything at Apple, to selling everything for $50 up front, to giving the games away for free with little ingredient sales, right? From building products that had deep engagement with people over a specific period of time, to building models that have shallow engagement over a longer period of time. Each one of these things, every business model shift here would have been devastating if the games industry didn't have a few cultural characteristics. So, okay, so you asked what are some of those characteristics. So let's talk about them. So I think the absolute first thing, and this is the topic of most of my thought process these days, is about real views on failure and risk. And generally speaking, companies talk a good game about what does failure mean, and how do we deal with failure. But typically, when a business fails at a particular project, that failure usually becomes a kind of foreign invader that the business wants to shed. So the people involved get pushed out, and they become embarrassed or uncomfortable, or the business wants to forget about it, and so you sort of lose this institutional memory. What you will find is that in most games companies, particularly the people doing the work, have been on projects that have been huge failures and successes, both. Yeah. And when they go through their list of credits, right, you can pull them back to like, oh my God, you worked on that was really, so one aspect of this is just that is real. And what that means, in many context is we have to start differentiating risk management from risk management. Mm-hmm. So most of the big businesses, and this includes the big tech companies that I work with a lot, they lump risk management into one function whose job it is to prevent the company from being, getting regulatory fines, sued, doing something unethical, so on. And so risk management training is all about reducing the company's risk to those kinds of things. We actually need to teach people the other side of risk management. And the other side of risk management is how to know when a risk is worth taking, how to differentiate risks that are good from risks that are bad. And it's a little bit like, I know this is, very topical, but, it's a little bit like trying to do sex education with children, by saying abstinence is the only option. You set it up that way, then you're going to have a whole, people are still going to do it and they're still going to learn, and it's just going to be haphazard and it's not well structured. So I think that this is the real risk management is sort of important. And then I think there's a couple of other big structural things, and we can talk about all of them. One of them for me is that innovation businesses, really innovative tech companies and games companies, they don't view their high-risk projects as projects. They view them as separate companies. And so there is this idea that it's not a project, it's a company. It's a sustainable business that you're trying to build with its own kind of, maybe share some infrastructure with its own management team, with its own identity, with its own sort of energy. And in the entrepreneurial space, and I've run a startup accelerator in New York for 5 years and done a lot of work with a number of accelerators. One of the things in the startup space is project is a dirty word. We don't use project. If someone gets up and says, my project is da-da, we'll be like, why are we at the science fair? That's not how you do a business. It's got to be a business and it's got to be sustainable. And so, I really feel like we've got to banish, this project thing from our repertoire. And, I think lastly, I would say one of the underappreciated skills of building an innovation culture is the ability to pitch. And so generally, we think of this ability to pitch as something that only, a certain tier of people in the organization have to be able to do, namely our salespeople or business development or executives. But actually, a culture of pitching, a culture where everybody is constantly trying to get their ideas heard and seen and acted on, is one in which there's the greatest chance that some of those projects are actually going to be real. And the fear of public speaking is so profound. People's concerns about even just getting up, forget starting an innovative project, just getting up and saying, I want to start this innovation project. The basic mechanics of that are so difficult for most people. So I think at a meta level, Stefan, what we need to do is actually look at the blocking and tackling of innovative game and startup companies and change those genetic sequences. Rather than being up here, we're actually doing the work down here.
Right. Let's start with risk. I like the elaboration about risk, and also I want to invite our guests that are joining us here tonight. If you have questions, please send us the questions, and we can join the conversation we have with Gabe. I'm sure you have some interesting questions, and use the time that we have together. My question goes to risk. I really like the distinction between the risk management part, that is the one that we all know. I think mainly any public company has a huge division that is only about risk management. It's about integrity. It's about compliance, like all these things, how to avoid mistakes. What you say about the other part, enabling employees to understand when to take a risk, sounds good in theory, but I'm asking, I'm looking to the German market. Germany, precision, country of engineering for decades, products made in Germany, perfection. So it sounds like, and very often what we see here in companies is a culture over decades that has been created and built and lived, that is driven by avoidance of mistakes, optimization of processes. Like if any mistake occurs, there is immediate reaction, and there has to be a protocol, and everybody has to analyze how it happened. And we do everything to avoid it. Do you think that there is a way, if you look at companies and independently from the size, let it be 500 people, let it be 5,000 or 50,000 people, if a company has that kind of a culture, how can they approach innovation? Because innovation, as you describe it, is taking risk and understanding that the more often you fail, actually, the better, because with every failure, you take a step and you learn. My impression is we don't have that. And how to overcome that? What do you think? What is necessary?
Yeah, I do want to qualify, first of all, I don't think the goal is to get you to fail all the time, right? Or as an organization.
Yeah.
I think what you need to do is remove the roadblocks to failure being a limiting factor in the organization. And that's different from like, I want you to fail all the time. It's more like if you fail and when, and we can even say when you fail, right? Because if you're doing something really innovative, almost every single startup, for example, has a pivot, which we've often talked about, that where they change their business. Anyway, so we have to set you up so that you create those opportunities and you're willing to embrace those opportunities and then learn from those opportunities rather than try to forget them, push them to the side. And by the way, that's been very difficult for me. I've had in the 6 or 7 startups I've run, I've had a few really big failures, and every time it sort of felt like a horrible weight on my back that I wanted to bury. And my like LinkedIn is not very accurate because people sort of put a shine on things. And so, some of my failures are really, they're sort of buried in my bio.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of bad. Okay. So I want to encourage people to kind of come out about that because I think it actually makes you better. So back to the company thing and the avoidance of mistakes and engineering accuracy. I say this with all respect. I feel like Germany has a couple of recent examples that highlight what the problem is when the culture has such an aversion to mistakes. The thing is, when you make a mistake in that sort of environment, in an anti-failure environment, the mistake balloons and compounds until it is Berlin-Brandenburg International, or the mistake balloons and compounds until it's Dieselgate.
Right.
It's the same as the 737 MAX issue at Boeing, which I've written about extensively.
Yeah.
What you really see is any place along the way, at any point in that ecosystem, if you had a pro-failure culture, somebody would have said, I'm pulling the plug. Stop, right? Yeah. Can't keep going. This isn't going to work. We need a different approach. Kill this, start again. Anywhere along the way, if the culture had not been, anti that, right? When VW was unable to meet its emissions targets, the solution was not to try to bury the emissions target, the emissions tracking, but to say, we're doing something wrong. We can't comply. Stop. Figure the whole thing out. Okay. So that's the kind of logical end of, being 6 Sigma, 7 Sigma focused intently as an organization. And, and so I think there's a lot of tools and techniques available at everyone's disposal that they can use to create innovation safely. Let's take the example of Boeing and the 737 MAX, or we can use VW, but let's just go with Boeing for a second.
Right.
So you don't build a plane, fill it with passengers, and fly it until you are pretty confident that in the models you're using, that plane is likely to fly, right? We have all these steps, we get all these gates along the way in the process. So zoom out for a second. That test bed is a perfect place for radical experimentation and radical rethinking and playing around with things that you can do even in a place where you can't really push products out that are not perfect. So one thing is looking at your sandbox, and I'll say every one of these companies I just listed has the world's most sophisticated engineering sandbox. They've got all the tools, all the toys, and yet they still made these mistakes.
Yeah.
And the reason why they made these mistakes is that the people involved feared what would happen if they came forward and said, this isn't working. And the organization made it clear to them, what was going to happen if that occurred. So I think at a meta level, and by the way, this is important in Germany, but also in like corporate America and everywhere else. What you need to do as a company, if you want to develop that innovation culture, like the games industry, you need to push all the way back on that pedal, the far opposite direction. So instead of being like, oh, and that's why I think people should be trained on appropriate risk management, because you need to really lean in. Can I give you an example of that?
Please.
Okay. So one of my favorite examples of this is a movement that some companies have started to do. Most notably, the biggest ones are Pfizer, the American pharmaceutical company, and Tata, the Indian conglomerate. So you know how every company has an innovation award at the, an award ceremony. At some point in the year, these are the best projects, it's our rising stars. They get up, the CEO shakes their hand and gives them a polo shirt or whatever it is that the prize is. Congratulations, and there's a certificate, right?
A mug.
Yeah, exactly, a mug. And so that's what we need, by the way, Stefan, more mugs. And so what's happening with this movement, which is called Dare to Try, is it's an effort to get the best projects that failed, so projects that were really valuable and really good and really useful but didn't work out, onto the stage at the same level with the same recognition as the projects that were successful. And that sounds sort of crazy, because that sounds like we're giving out prizes to people for messing up. But the actual point of that is people's fear of failure is so deeply ingrained, and corporate culture's aversion to failure is so deeply intertwined, that in order to break that, you've got to really hit it with a bat and send it off the other way.
So actually what you describe is, you can actually say that if you want to create that innovation culture, it means we need a cultural change. We need these organizations that have been around for decades working well, now being under pressure, not only COVID, but market changes, digital business changes, and they have pressure, and they don't know how to do it. So what do you think is necessary? And I have another point here that I would like to discuss with you. When we talk about innovation, there's incremental innovation, and automotive is great in that, because automotive comes up and say, hey, it's amazing, we have a new model, and you think like, oh wow, probably now the car is flying, and it's not. The car now has maybe the mirror, the external mirror can can flip in whatever or turn, so we have incremental innovation all the time. And then we have innovation that actually completely disrupts the business model. So that is even more radical. Like, how can you create a culture that allows even that, right? I would like to discuss that with you as well. So coming back to the culture, what culture is needed? And looking to the games industry, it seems the games industry early on, being disrupted 3 times at this time, has some flexibility, has a certain, I don't know, is it a kind of a leadership structure, leadership culture that made them tick differently and just be differently? Are they not as hierarchic? Like, what is the main difference to a traditional industry company that in Michigan, or that we have here in south of Germany?
One of my earliest observations about this with the games industry, which I think there are some lessons in here, is the games industry has always assumed that people from the outside of the games industry won't get it, and that they are going to constantly be struggling to be the underdog, to get people's attention, to try to create something that people actually want to use. And so it's this sort of scrappy mentality, right? And so right away, Stefan, you can see why that doesn't translate naturally to companies, even companies like Google. Why doesn't that translate naturally? Well, the more product market fit you have, so the tighter your product market fit is, the more risk averse you become. And I'm not a researcher. That's not my role. So I don't have the data to back that up. But it's one of the observations that I've certainly seen in my life, which is the more the consumer and the product are well meshed, the less likely you are going to be to say, well, let me upset that apple cart. Let me mess with that and change it. But you know that the flip side is the other thing that the games industry really understands, and this is very difficult for certain industries to wrap their head around. The consumer gets bored. The consumer wants something new. And the consumer is synthesizing all the factors in their life for all of the decisions that they make in their life. So that means as Apple ascends the hierarchy in product design, consumer purchasing desire for cars became more Apple-like. And the expectation for what you would get from a piece of technology that you buy increases kind of in that proportionally in that way. So the car industry's response to something like that is, well, let's put Apple CarPlay in our cars. But if you do that, you are giving Apple control over what is effectively the business. The business is that interface between the person and the product. Your UI is your business. And so I think you've got to like start with this idea that the consumer is going to get bored of your products, that nobody wants to have your product 5 years down the road. Even if it still kind of works, they're going to be thinking differently. They're going to be seeing the world differently. They're going to want different business models. So I think that's a like core sort of DNA difference in games. This kind of feeling like you've got to prove yourself all the time is a big piece of it. And then the other piece of it, which I think is very important, and we can pull in a couple of lessons here, is KPIs and metrics. So most people, when they think about innovation projects, and for many of you watching, I'm sure you've worked in a company where there's been an innovation group or an innovation council. And one of the things that those innovation groups and councils are not very good at is KPIs that transfer through the whole organization. Yeah. And you'll hear things like innovation doesn't respond to KPIs. It's not something you can measure. Why would we measure the number of projects launched or ideas generated? Like, none of that matters. Okay. And I'll give you the important counterpoint, and probably the best counterpoint ever, which is Netflix. So at Netflix, like every broadcaster, any of you on here from broadcast world, you probably know this or have worked in the broadcast world. Any broadcast network has what's called the cancellation rate. And that's the percentage of shows that are greenlit every year minus the percentage of shows that are sort of canceled. So you get this, this number that typically, it's actually the cancellation rate, not the renewal rate. That cancellation rate KPI is the one that people look at in broadcasting. Okay. So when you're doing content creation, right? Okay. So first of all, that KPI has a big psychological problem in that it is a negative number. So the goal is to get that number to be 0 rather than to make that number bigger. That's the typical goal and the typical view. And that is already a behavioral science problem, because it's much, much harder to get people to stop a behavior than it is to get them to start a new behavior. So one that's entrenched already is very hard to stop. Think smoking, overeating, whatever the case may be, versus new behaviors, which are easier to actually layer on and get people to do. So just by definition, a negatively structured KPI is going to negatively impact people's desire to engage with it and what that means in terms of culture. And Netflix, understanding this and also understanding what the real game of the business is, Netflix does this completely differently from every other broadcaster. And that is, they manage that number up. So the cancellation rate. So Reed Hastings has multiple times talked about how he looks at that cancellation rate, and if that number is not really high, then his view is the company's not innovating enough. And so he will go back and say, do something crazier, right? Wow. Do something, push the envelope. You're not pushing the envelope enough, right? And so I think even in those like little tiny mechanical ways, we need to find those KPIs that actually are indicators of innovation. And then we need to manage them up, and we need to manage them appropriately for the innovation challenge.
Yeah. I think as well, it's interesting how you describe that, and also the the attitude, because I think you're right. Maybe the inspiration is rather coming from the gaming industry, because a lot of the tech companies have a very traditional structure. Of course, we hear from Facebook, whatever, that it's very open, and everybody can participate, and and Google has you have a certain time that you can dedicate for new projects, etc. Still, there's always, what he hears, there's always if a failure in these companies as well to really become something big. Because if you look at some of the products that Google tried to launch, they were complete failures. It didn't work, and they spent a lot of money on it, right? And interesting enough, and I had the pleasure to look at Google X. They decided to actually put that in a separate company and say, we have Google X, and Google X is not a part of Google. It has the same name, but they're independent, and they have to be as crazy as they can. So question here is, do you think from a structural perspective, if a company, whatever industry, let it be consumer industry, let it be B2B, do you think setting up a separate team, maybe even a separate company to create those new ideas, is that a path that companies should go? Because I think there are examples. Some companies do it inside. They do internal accelerators, and we learned that a lot of them completely fail. Is one way to say, let's put it at the edge and let the teams run, and they're not part of our core business. Is that something maybe to accelerate innovation?
I would say, so I personally, just from my work experience and from my observation, I would say that those kinds of projects, the moonshot projects, should be in their own separate groups, because moonshots are just, they're really, really difficult. They're very high risk. Often if they're a true moonshot, they cost a lot of money. So they're not cheap projects, right? And those really require the organization to set aside some capital that's just for that kind of thing, and set aside people capital, human and cash capital, for that kind of thing. And I think this is an important moment, Stefan, to introduce a concept, because this is the most important guiding philosophical concept here, which is called portfolio theory.
Yes.
So many people know this already, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating something you already know, but portfolio theory is basically the economic model that says, how do you maximize the return of a basket of possible investments in a market, right? Typically, it's thought of as something you do with the stock market, but actually it applies to any aspect of innovation, investment in your life or your company, okay? So portfolio theory says that, some percentage of your investments are gonna yield nothing, some are going to break even, and some are going to generate a lot of money or opportunity or concept. So in the venture capital world, when venture capitalists put money into businesses, of every 10 businesses that they invest in, they expect 6 will not return any money. 3 will return some money, break even, maybe sell for a dilutive amount, a little bit comes back. And 1 of those companies is going to be a huge hit that's going to return for all the other losses that happen. So when you're a corporate executive, or you're thinking about for the company, or you're thinking about for yourself, normally when people think about how to increase performance of a portfolio, when they look at that model, they would say, okay, well, let's invest our energy in taking 1 of the 6 and moving them into the 3, and taking 1 of the 3 and moving them into the 1. But that's not at all what venture capitalists do. And it's not what Google does either, by the way.
Interesting.
What they do is they are looking in this cauldron of innovation, they're looking for signal in the noise. If the signal is it's not working out, project is dead. Your investor's not giving you more money if you're 1 of the 6. And frankly, so I had to shut down a venture-backed startup a couple of years ago. And I called my main investor, who's a really big venture capital firm, very, very, very seasoned, very successful. And I called up and I spoke to the CFO of the fund. And I was like, oh, hey, Michael, I think we're going to end up having to shut down. And he was like, okay, do you have any capital to return to investors? And I was like, I don't think so. We're going to need to pay off the remaining expenses. And he was like, okay, well, thanks. That was literally the conversation with my boss from that.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Yeah, because what they realized right away is it's not about getting upset and trying to solve the problem. It's as soon as you get the signal that things are not working out, you want to stop investing your time in that project. And so in order to do that, I think, it's easy to say, well, be ruthless, kill projects like Google does. But in order to do that, you actually need to see the whole thing as a portfolio first. You need to say, okay, I'm making 10 cars or I'm making 10 machines, new ideas. Only some percentage of them are going to work, and the rest of them are not going to work. And the sooner we kill it, the better. Absolutely.
We have the first questions coming in, and I want to, ask you to go with them with me. There's a question to the KPIs that you mentioned, and the first question is, what is a good tool to figure out those KPIs that you mentioned?
So great. This is often work that I do with people to think about innovation KPIs. I would say first and foremost, I would be looking at the KPIs that you already have through the lens of, is this a negative KPI? So is this KPI being managed in such a way that I'm trying to reduce something, right? That's the first thing, instead of grow something. And then the second question is, what does this KPI signify? When you take a step back, what does it mean for an innovation culture? Because often, like I gave you the example with Netflix, often companies are already tracking the right KPI, but the KPI is simply represented in the wrong way and being managed in the wrong way. So it really needs to be seen as a kind of opposite of that, of that idea. And so that's where I would always start. And then I think as a general and important framework for this, I would say your innovation KPIs should be connected to the core business, whatever the core business is theoretically, right? Those KPIs should be connected to the core business. So not an abstract one like number of new startups that we created. That KPI is actually not valuable, right? The valuable KPI there, just as an example, I'm not saying this is what your company should do, but if you've got a human capital challenge, the valid KPI there would be, number of new skills learned by our employees per year, right? So knowing that, okay, we're trying to upskill everybody on the team, and we're using these innovation projects to get that kind of thing. And of course, one of the things that also affects it, which I think is funny, is especially consumer companies, are often very focused on customer satisfaction as the core metric, the one that guides their overall view of everything. But once your product has relatively high customer satisfaction, you actually should be looking for more extreme reactions in the customer base, things that people love and things that people hate, not things that people like. Because assuming that you've already got basic product market fit, you've already got a sufficient level of like to make your product work. Now you're looking for the extreme views. I hate the notch in the iPhone. Right? I hate that it doesn't have a phone jack, whatever. It doesn't mean you have to respond to all of those things in the customer's view, but it does mean you need to understand what's pushing people's buttons. Where are they getting really worked up, and what implication does that have for the future?
Thanks. Question number 2. If innovation is a cultural challenge, are there geographical cultures in your experience that are more innovative than others?
Sure.
Yeah. And
so remember
what are those geographies?
Yeah. So I would say obviously the U.S. is always an outlier, and there's lots of arguments about why, but I tend to be in it's really immigrants driving that camp in the U.S. And so it all ends up coming back to the same thing, which is, do you have a drive as a person or as a culture to improve the way that things are? Do you feel threatened as a group? Do you feel like you have to, put some effort in? And, do you recognize that you've got to really punch above your weight to break through the limitations of your market or your industry or your country or whatever? And so I sort of bring it back typically when we talk about this to places like Israel or places like Singapore, right? Small countries where the people are, they're somewhat far removed, they're kind of in a kind of conflicty environment. And so what they've really done is, focused on broadly building a culture that is doing a lot of experimenting and trying kind of different things at the corporate level. All that having been said, you find great centers of innovation inside every culture. And if you're doing it in a German company, you have to do it with the acknowledgement of what German culture is like. And so that's why I said, in some places, Germany, Japan, well-established corporate America, maybe, I'm generalizing, right? But you have to actually take a baseball bat and hit the organization with that bat because the people are so far from that risk-taking, that risk-taking culture that, unless you overcompensate the other way, it's not gonna move the needle. But
maybe I want to add to that, looking at geographies is one part. Do you think we have a generation issue here as well? Is that something where you think like the typical stereotype would be the young people are, much more innovative and they want to change things. And of course, the old people that are, running those companies are not. Would you sign that? Would you say, yes, that's true? Or would you say, no, not true?
It is definitely, there's definitely an effect. And I think that's always been an effect, right? The young people are the innovators of the future. So I think there's definitely an effect there, but I actually think it really comes back down to this willingness to fail, the willingness to fall on your face.
Right.
And you can come to that frame. We've talked about all the different cultural aspects of it, but you can come to that place in your own life in one of a couple of different ways. You can either come there being very, very hungry, being poor, being hungry, wanting to be successful, knowing that you have nothing to lose. Or you can come to it with a great deal of resources, knowing that you have nothing to lose, right? But understanding that understanding that the losses, you'll be able to absorb the losses is an essential part of, liberating that. And so if companies treat people who take risks but fail as expendable resources immediately, then the message that you're telegraphing is that those risks, those risks that you took come with a serious consequence and a serious setback for you.
And usually it's happening for the last time. Usually those people do it once and they never do it again because the experience after that is it's like a trauma.
Absolutely. And that's exactly the point, right? Which is, so the people are going to be beating themselves up plenty. You don't need to beat them up. Actually, you need to do the exact opposite if you want them to do that again and to preserve the cultural environment.
Great. Next question. If you talked about the concept of gamification and also the learnings in your personal history when it comes to the games industry and the model. And the question is there a way to apply that concept to, other companies, no matter what industry they are? Do you think is there like learning, there's a certain pattern that you could apply to any company? And if so, what could it be?
Yeah, 100%. Let's look at automotive for a second. So there are a lot of things that Tesla has done that are important and meaningful. And from an auto engineer standpoint, of course, we know power management, aerodynamic efficiency, the manufacturing process to some extent. These are big areas in batteries. These are big areas in which Tesla has innovated and really moved itself forward. But I will argue that in the long term, the thing that Tesla did from an innovation standpoint that's radically different is to understand that the car is a platform and software is the business. Okay. So software is the business. You got to sell people the machine, but once you sell them the machine, you want to make software the model that they're actually buying. And it doesn't stop with the machine and become about service. It's actually about improvement. So for my Tesla, for example, my car has gained features consistently over the last 2+ years. It's actually got many more features today than it did 2 years ago.
Can you give an example, like a feature that you really enjoyed?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I'm really obsessed with the self-driving elements, and those have radically been improved. But one of the smaller examples, but still important, was Tesla added what's called dog mode and camp mode to the cars at one point. This was like a year and a half ago, and that feature basically allows you to set the car's temperature and to tell it to continuously run that temperature even after the driver has left. And that's so that you can leave your dog in the car for a short period of time, and you can sleep in your car if that's what you want to do, this camp mode, right? So don't turn off the HVAC when the driver leaves, right? This like very, very small little bit of innovation, right, is only possible because they see it as a software platform. And when they get the feedback from the customer saying, hey, this is a thing that would be really cool, they actually can sort of implement that feature. And what the shift to software in Tesla's model does is it enables new business models that are not possible, that have not been possible. Like, which they got me pre-selling me a full self-driving suite years before any such thing is available for $8,000. It's a lot of money. Yeah. Now it's gone up to 10, but it was on sale. Getting me to buy that, up front because I believe in the potential for the platform, and I believe that the platform will continue to add value. Yeah. So I think I think there, it's like a business model innovation. It's a software innovation. It's not actually as much about the hardware. The hardware is certainly important, right, but it's not really about the hardware. It's really about the software.
So, I think it's a great example. Automotive industry is one of the, as you know, one of the key industries we have in Germany. Yeah. And especially those, automotive industries here in Germany are struggling to compete. They were laughing about Tesla like some years ago. Still, of course they stopped laughing. They stopped laughing and suddenly took it very serious. Still, if you look at the fight they have inside to transform these companies into to be future proof and to be innovative beyond the feature, right? Beyond that feature which they always sell you as, I don't know, there's a new new lights, whatever. They always come with this incremental new innovation, and they pretty much look alike. So if you would advise, let's take Mercedes, let's take Daimler. If you could advise them on, how to create an innovation culture throughout the company, what would you tell them, like, to start with? Because they're very hierarchical, right? They have a very rigid system developed over decades. You need, if you're in some division, you need 7 to 10 levels of signing off. Start an idea, because everybody has to agree, and you can't go. So what do you recommend? And they also, by the way, they also tried with internal acceleration, with different startup like initiatives inside, which more or less were not so successful, right?
Not the best wins, right? I think I go back to something I said at the beginning of the conversation, which is you really need to reprogram the organization's DNA. I think every executive, certainly the way that we live today, everybody wants the one silver bullet. They want the one, if we just, start an innovation hub or do an accelerator internally, that will solve all of our problems. But we have to be willing to do the hard work here, because there's a lot of cultural negative cultural feedback or pushback about taking risks. And so we've got to really get into the weeds with people. We have to teach them appropriate risk management, as we talked about. We need to teach them how to pitch. We need to change the way we talk about the projects that we are working on. We need to demonstrate to people every day, all the time, that their risk-taking, if it's legal, right, that their risk-taking is appropriate and good and will be rewarded. And that's the hard work, Stefan. That's the work that many organizations.
And that takes time.
Yeah, they're unwilling to do. And by the way, I will tell you something. The video game industry doesn't magically, by dint of all the people coming together, young and weird and gamers, that didn't immediately produce this culture. This culture doesn't come from just by throwing these things into a well-designed open industrial space. You need to do the hard work.
And you need courage as well to take those steps, right? Because if we look at the decision process, to take those steps, what we see in the market is there's more push now from the capital side, ownership, like family-owned business that we have a lot in Germany called Mittelstand, who are actually pushing the envelope and asking their management to take measures to be to start changing. You hardly have that in public companies because of the ownership structure, because there's not one voice. There might be a fund that has maybe 2% of Daimler trying and pushing. And we see in from a governance perspective in Germany is as well probably a deficit that in most of the advisory boards we have in Germany are they are 10 years older than the management. So you have a lot of ex-CEOs that then become members of the advisory board. So they are out of business like for 10 years ago. So how can they look at the company and be a critical partner and pushing management into a new future? So all these things is what we see have to be solved as well.
Okay. Well, you brought up something interesting. I know we don't have a ton of time left, but you brought up something really interesting that I want to point out, which is, so when you look at the list of people who are on a board of advisors to a startup, the composition of a successful board of advisors is typically a mix of people bringing credibility to the enterprise, right? Because it's a startup. So they need some people who are like, when you see that name, you say, oh, of course they know what they're talking about, right? If they're pitching what's this moonshot, they've got the researcher from Stanford on the board, so they must be legit, right? And you have the people who have done it before and have the hard-fought experience. But as a general rule, the vast majority of those kinds of advisors are not people from your own industry and your own company. They're people who are bringing some kind of value add to the decision-making process. And there we have many problems with like public boards of directors, where we know there's like an oversight problem because those boards of directors aren't paying attention or whatever the case may be, but also that by choosing everyone at a particular level and choosing people who are constantly on boards, to do that, we end up with a more conservative culture. So my quick advice to everybody here is, in addition to your board of directors, in addition to your oversight board and your management board, all that stuff, what you need are a board of advisors, and that for every project. And that board of advisors should be composed of people who understand that the remit is to innovate and move stuff forward and bring their unique experiences to bear on them. So create a board of advisors for your project.
Yeah, so with a team that actually supports you in a critical way and is adding value, as you say, towards a development of the company and rather than keeping the old culture as it is.
Yeah, less oversight and more acceleration.
Acceleration, absolutely. Gabe, we have only. No, it's exactly 7 o'clock here, our time. I think LA time. Is it 11 o'clock or 10?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. So I want to thank you.
Oh,
I want to thank you for that wonderful insight and interesting exchange. I think there's a lot to take away from our conversation. I like the insight that we can learn something from the games industry that probably a lot of us have never thought about. Maybe we take another opportunity to dig deeper. I want to thank you for joining today. We will post, our conversation on all our channels. So let's stay in touch. I want to thank the audience and everybody who joined and everybody who asked questions for joining the Boma Studio today. Stay with us. Sign up for our newsletter, and keep if you want to keep informed. We do this regularly, probably every 2 weeks. We have interesting experts from all across the globe joining us for a conversation about the future. So with this, I leave you in LA with an exciting day about who might be the next president of the United States. The world is watching the United States right now. And I wish everybody here in Germany a great evening. Thank you so much for joining, and see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.